Арьян Ланкастер, это шеф трансплантации в Лейдене, в Нидерландах. Он же президент так называемой Inborn Working Party, и в контексте европейской группы по трансплантации костного мозга. То есть человек в трансплантации в иммунологии далеко не случайный и настоящий эксперт. И он, собственно, мы договаривались о 2 лекциях. Обе лекции, первая лекция будет посвящена, я не знаю в каком порядке, одна будет о проблемах серотерапии, иммунореконструкции, вторая фармакокинетики некоторых алкиляторов. Все это, кстати сказать, будет, насколько я понимаю, записываться на видео, потом это, если что, будет доступно для общего пользования. Арьян.
Well, thanks of all, Dmitry. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I didn't understand one word of what you just said, so that's a good start. So I hope you understand something of what I'm going to say. So again, thanks for the invitation. It's my first visit to Moscow and my second to Russia. And I am extremely impressed about this institute. It is in many ways overwhelming. And I hope that you realize that you're working in an institute that in a few years' time has become one of the major institutes in Europe for pediatric transplantation. So, and it's only a start. So I hope that you will continue to remain a very important partner in the European transplant community. So what I will do, I was asked to give 2 talks, so I hope you have some energy for that. I hope I have some energy for that. My first presentation will be on severe combined immune deficiencies, where I will mainly show some recent data that we obtained with the European group based on the SCATID database, which is a Paris-based database. And in my second presentation, I will focus on aspects of conditioning, research that we are doing on strategies to optimize conditioning for stem cell transplantation. And I've particularly picked a few topics that I think are very common to all of us, and I hope that we can collaborate on these issues. So probably in this audience, this slide needs not much introduction. Of course, we're talking about hematopoietic stem cells that give rise to all the peripheral blood stem cells. And these are the guys that we try to use in our stem cell transplant procedures. When I explain it to the students in my own institute, I kind of often say, well, realize what is the concept behind stem cell transplantation, because of course, in malignant diseases, we are actually mostly speaking about a rescue procedure to rescue the patient out of aplasia with donor stem cells. And of course, there is, but it's not the topic of today, the famous graft versus malignancy or graft versus tumor effect of allotransplantation. In non-malignant diseases, it's much more replacing what is not functioning, so to replace dysfunctional hematopoiesis. And there are a lot of examples for all the blood cell lineages involved. We have a tradition. We are not as big as your institute. We are a small country, so we do less patients, but we started already some time ago. In 1968, our institute performed the first successful transplant in a SCID baby in Europe. It was the second patient successfully treated in the world, and the patient is still alive. I actually met him 1 week ago. He's now 48, and we discussed his disease situation, and we even discussed how to do immunomonitoring at this moment to see how his immune system is doing. And why I particularly show this slide is that most people, if you ask them on the street and talk about stem cell transplantation, they think it's about leukemia. And that's of course true, but we have to realize that in the first 15 years of stem cell transplantation in Europe, not a single leukemia child was transplanted. It was only transplant for inborn errors, for immune deficiencies and bone marrow failure syndromes. When we talk about SCID, and this is just a very minimalistic slide, we know that there are a lot of genetic defects that interfere with a proper lymphoid immune repertoire generation because of all these different gene defects. And together we call them SCID. And of course they can only be cured with allogeneic stem cell transplantation at this moment. And we shouldn't forget about the aim of stem cell transplantation in these kids. Of course, they need a proper and new immunohematologic reconstitution, and particularly they need a proper T-cell thymic function. That is one of the main goals to rescue these kids who would otherwise die from their disease. If we do some epidemiology and we look at this slide, you can see that we've improved in time. And for the next couple of 7, 8, 9 slides, you have to bear in mind that on the y-axis of all the slides that I'm showing to you, you see survival, which is of course extremely important. But in the second part of my presentation, I will talk not about survival, but the quality of survival. But when we look at survival, we can see that we do much better than we did 3, 4 decades ago, if you take all SCID transplants together, and probably the curves will step by step further improve. If we then zoom in at a more recent period of the last 10 years, and we look at the outcomes for SCID transplants in general, so all genetic causes put together, then we can clearly see that there is a difference in outcome whether you use a sibling donor or a match unrelated donor or a mismatched donor. And again, this is putting all the European data together. So this does not correct for individual institutional experiences. This is putting everything together. So it is quite clear that the matched donors do much better, even in the last decade, than the mismatched donors. We have to bear in mind that this is something, and that's why I put it in the title, it's really on the move, because a lot of centers will probably not recognize themselves in this figure, for example, this center. So what we did with the European group is to put together the outcome data of SCID transplantation in the last decade. So it's 504 patients that were evaluable, meeting the following criteria. Typical SCID diagnosed and transplanted before the age of 1 year. And there was a subgroup that was also included in which the diagnosis was made in the first year, but the transplant was performed within the first 15 months. Just to correct for some patients that were diagnosed at 11.5 months and transplanted at 13 or 14 months of age. So this is a very full table, but it kind of summarizes all the genetic variants. And as we know, common gamma chain, REC1 and ADA SCID represent the major subgroups in this cohort. So if we look at the outcomes and we simply start by checking whether T minus B minus SCIDs, how they do in comparison to T minus B plus SCIDs, we see that there is a slight trend for improvement of the B minus SCID group in the last decade, if you compare it to, on the left side, the previous time period. And traditionally, the B minus SCIDs did worse than the B plus SCID, but step by step they seem to be improving because of various reasons. If we then look at the outcome in the last decade for the various donor types, and you compare those with the overall group of the last almost half a century, then you can see that there is still an improvement in the most recent decade for most donor types, but particularly for the mismatch-related donor types, so the haploidentical transplantations. An important thing, which I think you will recognize as well in your institute, are the characteristics of the SCID patients when they start at the transplantation. So there is the aspect of age, and we know that in older children the outcomes are often slightly worse because mainly of infectious complications, and this is both the European and the North American experience. And if you zoom in at the impact of infections present at the time of transplant, you can see what is more or less expected, that patients with infections pre-transplant have a worse overall survival compared to patients that have no or very little pre-transplant infections. And I just yesterday discussed with Alessandra about the average SCID patient here in Moscow, and quite often those patients enter the hospital as really sick babies. So you can imagine that there is room for improvement over there to have the babies in a better condition when they receive the transplant, and I will make a few comments on that at the end of my presentation. So when you combine these data, it is not so much the age of the patient, but the presence of infections that has a major impact on the survival of those patients. The graft source being used doesn't make a huge difference. Bone marrow, the traditional source, of course mainly used from sibling donors, has the best results, but both cord blood and peripheral blood stem cells, mainly haploidentical transplantations, have comparable outcomes. Again, this is putting everything together. I'll skip this because of time. The impact of conditioning is a long-lasting and still not fully resolved issue. Should you condition SCID patients when they receive a transplant, yes or no? If you look at, again, survival, so not quality of the immune system, but survival, these figures suggest that it doesn't make any difference for a true SCID baby. And we know that there are very respectable institutes in especially North America that still have the policy not to condition their SCID patients, with the argumentation not to induce toxicity or long-term toxicity. If we go into somewhat more details with respect to the different SCID genotypes, we can see that in the last decade, the outcomes for the different genotypes is rather comparable if you look at the T-, B- SCID, so REC deficiency and Artemis deficiency and ADA deficiency. If you look at the T- B+ SCID subpopulation, then the common gamma chain survival rate is very good, and the IL-7 receptor deficient SCID seem to do slightly worse. And we are currently analyzing, in collaboration between Europe and the United States, whether it really holds this information if we zoom in at the details of these patients, and what might be the possible explanation for this slightly inferior outcome in the IL-7 receptor SCID patients. One of the long-lasting and important aspects of stem cell transplantation for SCID is, of course, the occurrence of graft-versus-host disease. And I think most of us will agree that there is really no beneficial effect to be expected from graft-versus-host disease in a non-malignant disease, and particularly not in babies with SCID. Have we improved in time? Yes and no. If you look at these figures, then the percentage of patients having graft-versus-host disease grade 2 or more in the last decade is exactly the same as when we started half a century ago. So these data suggest that we've learned little, or that we have improved little. Of course, it's not completely fair because we've done different types of transplants for different types of SCID, but the take-home message at this moment is that graft-versus-host disease is still a serious thing to solve in these patients. Does it have an impact on survival? Yes, it does, because patients with graft-versus-host disease more than grade 3, they really have an inferior outcome compared to patients that have lower or no GVHD. So there is still a medical urgency to develop strategies that are accompanied by a very low risk for graft-versus-host disease. So if you summarize these survival data, you can say, okay, we've learned in time, we've improved in time. The survival with matched donors, either sibling or matched unrelated donors, is really good. There is a slightly inferior outcome for mismatched donors, but we are making progress, and especially the developments in the field of haploidentical transplantation are not to be ignored. And I mention this in particular because in the decision-making how to deal with your patient, one of the important new kids on the block is, of course, stem cell gene therapy. And in the stem cell gene therapy trials that have been performed so far, the argumentation has always been to only provide or offer these gene therapy approaches to patients lacking a matched donor because of the difference in survival. And the question is whether all the developments, the technical developments in the field of haploidentical transplantation will change this hierarchy. So while we are improving or bringing more and more to the clinic gene therapy for SCID, there's also the improvement in the outcomes for mismatched donors. So we will see how this develops in the next couple of years. Clinic gene therapy for SCID, there's also the improvement. This is our first patient, transplanted in 1968. How this develops in the next with an X-linked SCID. Transplanted with an infusion without conditioning of his HLA identical sister, and as to be expected, this patient developed into a split chimer, so the T cells were obviously of donor origin, but the vast majority of his myelopoiesis and of course B cells has remained of a recipient origin. He is a survivor. So in all the curves that I've shown so far, he is doing well. He's a survivor and a success. But is that really true? Because if you meet him, yes, he has a job, he has a family, it's a very nice person, but these are his hands. And you can't call this a success. And he has frequent infections because his immune system is suboptimal. He has very limited thymic function. And if you look at the panel at the lower right, you can see a study that we performed quite some years ago where we measure the TRAC levels, so as a representation of thymic function. And this is the patient. So you can see that this patient really has very, very low TRAC levels. And he has another 30 years to go, because normally you would expect that a male of his age would be have a life expectancy of 75 or 80 years old. So how does his life look like in the next couple of decades? We had long discussions whether we could do something on his immune system, on his poor immune system. And of course you could consider a second transplant, but would a second transplant be effective in a patient of, let's say, 30, 40 years old that has never had a normal thymus? What could you expect from a transplant like that? And maybe it could also do harm to him. You can even die from a transplant. But after long discussions, we tried kind of a middle-of-the-road approach. We tried the safe approach, and we only performed an infusion of CD34 stem cells from his sister. And we actually didn't expect major changes, to be honest, because his marrow is already filled with autologous cells. But actually, some things changed. We saw an increase in NK cells, and I'll come back to NK cells later on in my second presentation. And more importantly, he, for whatever reason, felt much better after the CD34 boost. His quality of life improved. So have we done something or didn't we do anything? We don't know. But I think the most important reason why I show this slide is there are survivors that are really having an inappropriate immune system, which puts them at risk for all kinds of complications, like we encountered in this patient, transplanted in the early 80s for an IL-7 receptor deficiency. He was transplanted with a single mismatched sibling. he also had already at the start a very poor thymic function. And you know, if you have a poor immune system, then you're at risk to develop lymphomas. And so he did. He developed a lymphoma when he was halfway his 20s. It was complicated because of the underlying disease, because of the treatment. He went into cytopenia. He had CMV problems. Mind you, the donor was CMV negative. And after long discussions and complicated ifs and buts, we decided, or at least the adult hematologist decided, to give him a second transplant, which really had a bumpy ride, and finally he died out of because of various complications. So a second example of a long-term survivor that is nicely a survivor in the curves. If you would have looked at him 1 year before he developed lymphoma, but it is really a situation that is far from optimal. So for that reasons, to get a better insight in what happened with the SCID patients that were transplanted in a more recent era, and not just to focus on survival, we started a project which is not finished yet, but which is in progress, to get more information about the immune status of SCID patients. So we approached the 10 largest contributors for SCID transplantation in the last decade in Western Europe, and we came up with more than 200 patients. We approached the individual centers and asked for immune monitoring data as far as available, focusing on these cell populations. And I'll show you a few graphs just to give you a first impression. Again, the final analysis is ongoing. But what you see over here, that at 2 years post-transplant, and about 40% of the SCID transplanted patients is still dependent on IVIG. So is that cure or is that not cure? It's debatable. If you look at the immune reconstitution, and we focused on T cells, CD4 cells, NK cells, B cells and naive cells, we observed the following. And on the y-axis, it's important to realize that we see the percentage of patients that has this particular cell population within the range of normal healthy controls. And the question is whether that is a fair comparison, but at least it's a very strict comparison. So what we observed is that both the T cells and the CD4 cells are in most patients transplanted for SCID within the normal range for their particular age. However, if you look at the naive CD4s, so the thymic output, it's already less. So it's a bit dependent on where you focus on, whether you call this a success, yes or no. And as expected, if you compare patients that are either or not on immunoglobulin support, you can see that the patients that are not on immunoglobulin support have much better T cell values and also better thymic function compared to the ones that are still on immunoglobulin support. Again, this is putting all SCID types together. When we focus on the different genotypes, and again on the y-axis you can see again the cell numbers with their percentage within the normal range, you can see that the overall T cell numbers and CD4 numbers are more often within the normal range compared to the naive T cell production. And especially for ADA SCID, but also for Artemis, you can see that a minority of the patients has a naive T cell output that is within the normal range for their particular age. This is kind of interesting, and we are still working on this. I already mentioned the impact of graft-versus-host disease. Patients that survived graft-versus-host disease did not have a worse immune system if you look at these cell numbers compared to patients that did not develop graft-versus-host disease. So you cannot simply say that graft-versus-host disease is damaging thymic epithelium and therefore having a poor consequence for poor thymic function in the long run. Again, this is the survivors. Because of time, I'll skip this. When we look at the different graft sources that were being used, we can more or less see that whether you use peripheral blood stem cells, mainly the haploidentical transplants, cord blood, mainly unrelated cord blood, or bone marrow, you can see that most patients have comparable numbers of CD3 positive cells and CD4 positive cells, but there might be some differences in the thymic function, and we are still working on the details to understand whether this is related to certain genetic subtypes of SCID or not. So if you summarize these interim data, I think we can conclude that the overall survival in SCID transplantation continues to improve in time. If you look at survival and quality of your immune system, we are talking about two different things. So a survivor is not necessarily having a good immune system. And there is also, and that's I think important to realize, that having normal numbers of total T cells does not necessarily mean that your thymic function is okay. So detailed analysis of your immune repertoire is, I think, important to have the full picture. And therefore we will continue, hopefully as much as possible in a prospective way, with immunomonitoring in SCID patients that are being transplanted throughout Europe to really understand whether they have a proper immune system and where we can improve. I'll just show a few slides to share with you that sometimes it can be confusing. This was a child transplanted several years ago in our unit for a ZEP70 deficiency. She had EBV problems pre-transplant. She was transplanted at the age of 6, so not a usual age for a SCID patient. She was transplanted with a regimen which is, I think, very familiar for you over here, triosulfanfludarabine, with a fully matched unrelated donor. So conditioned, good donor. Still, she ended up as being a mixed chimera. And when we zoomed in more detail, as you can see in the graph, only a very low percentage of both the mononuclear cells and the granulocytes was of donor origin. However, if we zoomed in at the T cells, and particularly at the CD8 positive T cells, they were of course mostly of donor origin, and even the percentage of CD4 and mainly the naive population was within a normal range. The child is doing perfect, responded normal to vaccination responses, and is really doing like an age-matched control. So based on these results, you might think, well, she's doing not optimal, but from a functional point of view, she's doing quite well. And the parents are quite nervous because at each visit they ask, what is chimerism doing? What are the T cells doing? And if they decrease from 600 to 500, they are in major distress. And if they increase from 600 to 700, they are very happy. And for us, it's of course all the same. Should we do something with this child? No, we decided just to leave it because from a functional point of view, she's doing fine. But whether she is at risk in the long run for, let's say, suboptimal immune system related problems, like one of the patients that I showed before, remains a question. A few words on neonatal screening. Within North America and in some European countries, and we are starting a pilot study in the Netherlands next year, the role of neonatal screening for SCID is an important issue. And why is it important? As I already mentioned, the clinical situation of a SCID baby pre-transplant, and especially whether it's affected by serious infections, has a major impact on the overall survival of these patients. So if you would be able to identify those patients before they really have disease from their genetic abnormality, we might be able to improve. And the most important, I think, evidence for this was provided by the UK group, who really showed that if you look at the left side, those are babies that were the first diagnosed cases in the family, how their clinical course was. You can see that the overall survival is really poor. Whereas if there was an index patient in the family, so everybody was already aware of the risk of having a second child with SCID, you can see that the overall survival was much better. So those patients were being transplanted in a much better clinical condition compared to the probands. Well, as you know, neonatal screening is spreading, and I expect that at least in our country it will be officially implemented in the next couple of 2 or 3 years, like in some other countries. I would like to share a very peculiar experience that has to do with conditioning, yes or no. We transplanted quite some years ago a baby with a RAG2 deficiency with an infusion of his phenotypical identical mother. The outcome was that the child ended up as a split chimer. And then something interesting happened. So the T cells were of the donor, the rest of the hematopoiesis was of the patient itself. And then the patient developed progressive bone marrow failure. And he even had features of an aplastic anemia patient. And at a certain moment, and you can see it over here, all the blood cell counts dropped really to 0 levels. And at this moment, the patient only had some residual donor T cells and had completely wiped out his autologous myelopoiesis. At this moment, we infused CD34 enriched cells as a boost, and the patient fully recovered, became 100% donor in all lineages, had very, very, very minimal graft-versus-Host of the skin that disappeared in no time. So the end result of this procedure was that the patient ended up as being a full donor with a fully competent T cell repertoire, with nice thymic output, with naive T cells, of immunoglobulin support, without having received a single drip of conditioning. And people in the Hem-Onc field know this, because if you give DLIs to patients with CML, you can wipe out the complete autologous marrow. But this is, I think, a nice example of the strength of the immune system. And of course, you would like to use in future some of these concepts to develop novel conditioning regimens where you can deal with less chemotherapy and maybe even no chemotherapy, although that's a far stretch. So the future goals in SCID transplantation, I think, are to develop and to improve on regimens that result in optimal immune system, so not to end up as our patient number 1 and the patient that died from secondary lymphoma. We have to be very careful about the non-immune aspects of these diseases, like in ADA SCID and some other new SCID variants. I've called it next generation conditioning, and I already discussed a little with Dimitri on this issue an hour ago. And I think we should really make steps to be smarter than just giving chemotherapy and stick with that. Early diagnosis in combination with newborn screening is, I think, an important thing to improve the outcome of our transplant. And then, of course, the question is, what can we do with gene therapy? And gene therapy, I think I didn't put in the slides in here, no. Gene therapy, it is an important aspect. It's still mainly used in trials. We have to realize that at this moment there is one modality of gene therapy that has even market authorization for ADA SCID. And the most recent results from ADA SCID gene therapy outcome show that the survival and the immune function in gene therapy treated patients is comparable with matched sibling donor transplants. So in the current hierarchy of the Inborn Errors Working Party, if you have a SCID baby with ADA SCID, and if you have no matched sibling donor, you do not go to haplo, you do not go to a matched unrelated donor. the advice is to go for gene therapy. And that was 10 years ago unthinkable. In our own institute, we will start a gene therapy trial which will be multinational for RAC1 deficiency. So I expect that in the next 5 or 10 years, more and more gene therapy will become a serious candidate to be considered instead of instead of conventional allogeneic stem cell transplantation. So I'll end up with my institute. As you can see, this is the Leyden University Medical Center. Somewhere here is our transplant ward. This is our research building, which is very crucially closely connected to the clinical units with all the research and animal facilities. And if you ever want to visit us, it's really easy, because here is the railway station. It brings you in 15 minutes to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport. So if you ever want to visit us, you can almost do it on a daily basis. So I look forward to meet you over there, and we'll have a short break for questions before we go to the second presentation. Thank you.